And we are going live. And we are live.
Ron. What are you up to today?
Hello, Chris. Just living another day in paradise, working as a cybersecurity professional. How about you?
I wish I were at the beach.
Yes, that's always a great answer.
Well, I heard you didn't finish up the last class, so I'm gonna let you finish up with the all famous zero trust.
Very good. Well, let me share my screen and welcome everybody to the 2024 CISSP CISSP Mentor Program. Boy, that's hard to say. Try to say that 10 times fast. I'm Ron Werner. With me today is Christoph Foulon. We will be a little bit tag teaming, talking about domain 4 communications and network security. We started off the domain last session, so if you didn't catch the first half, go check it out. It's published out on the YouTube. Show you where we are. Well, we are actually on May 1st, 2024, as we record this, but we're talking about the domain of communication network security. Let's see. Just as a reminder, this is what we cover. It gets to be quite technical. So if you're one of the non-tech folks who join us for this is a good opportunity to stretch your wings in practice. In the last session, I showed you numerous ways you can practice at home, just through a simple command prompt, whether you're using Windows or Mac. Mac is basically a Linux variant, and numerous sites and tools like Wireshark. So if you're not using Wireshark, get comfortable with it. It really will help you. Actually, before we jump into the chapter, something that happened today was the publication of the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. It's an annual report, been coming out for well over a decade, maybe two. Use it to supplement your studies. We know the book can be kind of dry and boring. So read through reports like that. Mandiant and numerous other organizations have similar reports. Read through it and use it as part of your studying. It's really what a CISSP exam is looking for as a cybersecurity practitioner, how well you understand the concepts behind it. So Chris mentioned about the zero trust thing. Slide down to
I don't
find that
trust you.
slide.
I don't trust you.
I don't trust me either. So Chris, if you remember the saying, I think Reagan said it in the 80s, trust but verify.
Yes.
So we've changed that now. Zero trust is both technical concepts, but it's also almost a philosophy developed well over a decade ago from a company called Forrester, where I happen to work. John Kindervag realized that we were not doing security well because we were allowing too many entities in. We were trusting too many entities. So it's not about not trusting each other as humans. On the internet, who really can you trust? I mean, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. Remember that cartoon? So in developing zero trust, they came up with these different components, sometimes known as pillars. This actually is the drawing from Forrester. You can read their information on it publicly available. The idea with zero trust is putting security as close to the asset you want to protect as possible. In the old days, we used to have a VPN, right? And then once you were inside, you could do anything, go anywhere. How many of your organizations have a flat network? And that once you're inside, it's fair game? That's kind of dangerous today. Other news, there was a well-known health organization that was not using multi-factor authentication that kind of got caught, got breached. Zero Trust helps fix that. So you put security as close to the data or application you're protecting. So the different parts of it are data, people, or identity. You may hear identity is part of the new vernacular of zero trust. Then devices, considering BYOD, anyone can be using any type of device. networks. So this is where you'll see ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Architecture, moving away from the traditional firewall to where you're using something known as microsegmentation, which I'll talk about momentarily. Workloads. Yeah, Chris.
When you think about that, think of before it was a castle and moat, but once you got inside, all the doors were open. Think about putting locks on all the doors inside. So even if you get into the castle, all the doors are locked. So the treasure is still protected.
Exactly. It's identifying those crown jewels. Great analogy there, Chris. Workloads was confusing to me at first. It's your operating systems, your applications, making sure they have the right security in place. Wrapping around all of this is visibility and analytics. So Zero Trust is about continuous monitoring, knowing what's happening within your castle. Yeah, like you just said, Chris, we wouldn't know who's going where within the castle. Well, consider that we now would have security cameras and monitoring everywhere and door locks. Automation, orchestration. We may get into later SOAR, security orchestration, automation, and response. How do you take the manual procedures? If something's happening that's kind of odd, don't you want to automate how to protect against it? And then through that is governance. Okay, so that's Zero Trust in 3 minutes, lots of materials. Reason why I'm taking some time to talk about Zero Trust is I'd almost be surprised if you did not see a question about it. It's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years as a way of securing our infrastructure.
And if you could talk about this on a job interview and speak about it in a very articulate fashion, it will set you apart from your competition.
That is a great point. Yes. Being up to date and being able to talk about the technical details of Zero Trust. For example, you could be asked about microsegmentation. How would you do that on a network? The idea is to establish micro perimeters. So think about the perimeter, the moat around the castle. The micro perimeter would be an area around the crown jewels. Like if you ever visit the crown jewels in the Tower of London, it's actually Zero Trust in action, where when you go to visit the crown jewels, they're encased in a glass case. There's lots of cameras. You can't just stop and look at them. You're on a conveyor, basically, that keeps you moving. So with microsegmentation, should be familiar with the term software-defined networking. As I mentioned last session, networking, when we did segmentation in the old days, showing my gray beard, you would have to do it with network switches. Well, now we can do everything virtually. So this is tied to the idea of VLANs. So the central management, where you can establish who should have access to which portion of the network almost autonomously. And that's also an idea with Zero Trust, moving from the traditional role-based access control to risk-based or attribute-based access control, just-in-time access. How many of you have access to way more stuff than you need to at your work? Pretty typical. In fact, that was part of the problem with the healthcare organization that got breached. Sysadmins wanted to make their job easy, so they allowed internet access to internal resources, not using Zero Trust. So a software-defined network really prevents that by allowing more dynamic access control. With the data plane, being able to separate data from the operating systems. This way, if someone gets into the OS, they're not going to see the data as well. So that's understanding these different layers. One last point on this is about that east-west traffic flow. That's in between systems and servers. That's the pivoting. When I showed MITRE ATT&CK framework last session, you saw pivoting as one of the techniques. You want to reduce that. So north-south is from the internet inside. East-west is internal. Oh, let's see. And this shows an example. Think of an example with payment card industry. You have your cardholder data environment, CDE, holding credit cards. That needs to be segmented from the rest of the network per the data security standard. So that's the rules. Oh, let's see. Other terms you will see is Zero Trust Edge, SASE, software access security edge. Basically, what you're doing, software application security edge, is at the application layer, putting the boundary. Tools like and applications like Zscaler are an example. This way, the access is controlled as close to the application as possible. With networking, the WAN, the SD-WAN. So these all combine as a part of Zero Trust. So a lot of technical details associated with Zero Trust. One last little point you may have heard is VPN dead. With Zero Trust, should we still be using a VPN? I say yes, because when I'm traveling and I'm on an insecure hotel network that is not using Zero Trust, and I know not everything I use is Zero Trust, I still use a VPN as kind of a belt and suspenders approach. So that's Zero Trust in a nutshell. Anything else you wanted to add, Chris?
No, I would just say, think about back to that moat and castle. You have those rooms, you have those corridors, and that's how you can envision it in your head.
Exactly. So I will turn the show back to you, Chris, and you can continue with chapter 6.
Okay.
Stop sharing. I will stall. So as Chris mentioned, it is a potential interview topic. There's a lot of material out there about Zero Trust. So if it's something new to you and you're not seeing it in the regular study guides, pull it up. Center for Internet or the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency has a Zero Trust maturity model. I mean, lots of good videos out there on it. So take it away, Chris.
Okay. Wow. Jumping on to part 2 of domain 4. I'm Christophe Foulon, virtual CISO. Housekeeping. Keep chats, everything constructive, respectful. Do not share anything religious, political. Do not share anything copyrighted. Just a reminder for everyone. Okay. That being said, now we fixed this. We're on to part 2, May 1st. I added Ron's name there to give him credit for last week. Let's do some review questions. You can find me on the LinkedIns. You can find me on the Twitters. Wait, X. I don't keep up anymore. That's where I'm at. Been a career coach, dad, wrote a couple books. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check those out. Little plug. And I love Baby Yoda. I have Baby Yoda everywhere. So look out for Baby Yoda in the middle of this presentation. Okay. You can also find me using this handy dandy QR code if you trust me. Do or do not do. There is no try. Okay, Boomer. On to the show. Study tips. Small, frequent study sessions, highly recommended. This goes back to my own study days. I use flashcards today. There are flashcard apps you can use. Take naps after heavy topics like security models or Zero Trust. And then we have our Discord channels. Everyone, you can help each other out. Not everyone's at the same place. So there might be some of you that are more advanced than others. Help each other out. And then shout out to Ron for Monday. Okay. Reminder, this is still the book. Still using it. This is the book that we're studying from. Shout out to Arthur Dean. Used to work with him. Great individual. Okay, do not share electronic versions of the book. Reminder. Okay, ready for a dad joke? What kind of cars takes you to a Jedi? Ron, you want to guess? Okay.
I don't know, Chris. What kind of cars
I-
take you to a Jedi?
A Toyota.
Nice, of course.
Told you. There's Baby Yodas everywhere. Okay. Now, study review question. Ben connected his laptop to his tablet using 802.11 AC connection. What wireless connection mode did he use? And for those of you that bought the study guide book, it will not match up the answers A, B, C, D in the book because I twisted them around so that you just don't memorize them. And the answer is ad hoc mode, where you can connect two of these clients together. Okay. Alice's company has implemented MFA using SMS messages to provide a numeric number, a form of authentication, as Ron just covered. What is the primary concern that Alice might want to express about this design? Messages can be spoofed. Messages can be stored on the device. Messages can be viewed on more than one device. Or messages are not encrypted. Technically, they all are true, but the ones that we're most concerned about is that messages are not encrypted and therefore can be sniffed. The reason that we don't worry as much about the others is that, yes, we know that they're stored on the device, but in theory, they change every 30 seconds. They can be spoofed by other senders, but then you would know that you're being sent a token that you didn't request. And they can be captured on more than one device. Yes, Apple, Google, they all created ways of sharing messages across more than one device. So it's not the primary concern here. Okay, next one. Which of these is not an example of a converged protocol? So the definition of a converged protocol is combining two protocols together. In this case, the answer is MIME. Multi-Internet Mail Extension is not a converged protocol, whereas Fiber over Ethernet, iSCSI, and VoIP are all made up of more than one protocol. Okay. Whoops, placeholder. Okay. Today's concepts will be associated with network, hardware, and transmission media, with some foundational coverage over endpoint security. First, we need to remember that you have to create policies, standards, and guidelines that security professionals, must be trained to perform and ensure what is and isn't covered. Change control here is fundamental. We need to be able to tell when something isn't at the defined configuration and therefore could be a potential threat. How do we do this? We monitor. We monitor against drift, which is change from what it should be to what it is now. And we also want to make sure that we're monitoring for changes in inventory, too much inventory, or any maintenance that might take a device down. So we're kind of going through firewalls, allowing traffic in, out. Well, maybe not. We also want to look at ingress and egress. As Ron mentioned, once you get into the castle, you're going to want to get out. And if you're a threat actor, you're going to want to get whatever you came into the organization for out of it. And you can't do that without egressing one way or another. So firewalls stop unwanted network traffic or unauthorized network traffic based upon rules, creating that boundary, that castle moat idea. Kind of creates that public-private separation And you can also create internal firewalls that create that almost zero trust network-like approach. The most secure way is default deny, but that means you have to listen to everyone telling you, my application isn't connecting. Well, you didn't submit a change control to allow your traffic in or out. So just like any other piece of hardware, you have to maintain it, you have to update it, and make sure that you're logging critical events. There's 4 basic types of firewall. Now, these are going to get very technical, so you're going to want to pay attention. So first one, static packet filtering. This here is between network layer 3 and 4, and you're looking for the packets to contain an IP address or a host name or something like that, which will stop it at the firewall. Kind of like screening, kind of the security guard that's feeling for something unwanted. Yep, that's what you're looking for. Fast, simple, but also the least secure. Then you have application level firewalls. These focus at the top layer. They allow traffic to and from a specific application. So you can have different layers of firewalls. You can have your static one and an application one. This creates multiple layers of security. So an example of that would be a gateway or a proxy. A little slower, definitely more complex, but it is very secure. Next, we have stateful inspection firewalls. These also act at the network transport layer. And what they do is they look for active sessions. So if a connection request didn't come from my computer to Ron's computer, it's not going to let it through. That's SYN-ACK approach. So it's a little harder to bypass because if you can't see the data, you can't request it. Then you have circuit level firewalls. These act at the session layer. These act for things like RCP connections, NetBIOS connections, things like that. Operates like a stateful firewall, but doesn't inspect the traffic. So it has to come from a gateway. Then we have fancy dancy next generation firewalls. They kind of add your intrusion detection, intrusion prevention aspect at the firewall level. So what they do is they combine your application layer with something going, is this supposed to happen? Not supposed to happen? And then can alert based on abnormalities. So some firewall architectures here. This is an example of a DMZ. You have to go from your inside into your DMZ zone before it goes to the external, or vice versa. This DMZ zone acts as a way to interface between your 2 different zones. You can also have DMZ zones inside your network as well if you want to create that micro segmentation that Ron was talking about earlier. Bastion hosts, sometimes referred to as jump boxes. What this would do is it would force you to log into a separate machine that then logs into a limited number of applications. So a great example of this would be if I were working with Ron, he would have me log into the Bastion host, and the Bastion host would only allow me to contact Brandon. And that's all I'm allowed to do once I'm in that machine. And then when I'm done, Ron tears down that Bastion host and there's no more communication to Brandon. So here's an example of this. Screen subnets is a combination of different bastion hosts, but not always. But it really illustrates what I was talking about earlier, where you kind of have that DMZ zone and different ways of communicating with the things inside as well as the outside. Web servers go through your router. Everything else goes through the router as well. So in today's environment, there's not just one way to do it. You want to create the most efficient way, but the best way for your organization. And then there's others, virtual private clouds, firewalls as a service, security groups, things like that, depending on what cloud service provider you have. They could have a different name, but think of it as a similar approach. So here's an example. Ron was talking about if you had your credit cards, you wouldn't want your actual credit cards to go into the non-production environment, just as you wouldn't want your test accounts to go into your production environment. You want them to have access to just what they're supposed to have. Back to the OSI model. So hubs, repeaters down there, physical, dumber, application firewalls at the top, smarter. So we're talking about hubs here. They're just a way of repeating the same port. So very much a security risk. Sometimes back in the day, as a help desk person, when I only had one outlet in a room and I needed to connect multiple machines, back then, all we had were hubs that we could do that. Today, you could really buy a switch that allows better control over the multiple ports in that room, so you can turn on an individual port and turn it back off when you didn't need it. Speaking of switches, kind of bridge the link between your physical and your data link a little bit smarter than your hubs, because they can actually control where your packets are flowing to. They use MAC addresses and also a spanning tree algorithm, which decides on which switch might be best to send what traffic where in the land. Here's an example. You have two hubs. The data traveling between host C and D can crash into each other because it's being replicated along the same line to the bridge. So you want to avoid that where possible. Now, here with a switch, you can actually control and prevent collisions from happening. Oops. Here we go. So here, switches can create virtual LANs, microsegmentations, things like that, where you can separate your applications, your servers on different segments, different virtual LANs, and better control access with a layer 3 switch. So switches operate at layer 2. There's no routing capabilities, but it does use the MAC address to send traffic where it needs to go. Routers can act on the network level, so uses IP address rather than MAC addresses to direct the traffic. And this also then allows you to send traffic across multiple different networks, which is different than virtual LANs. Virtual LAN is just a segmentation of a physical network. Routers will minimize collisions and increase the broadcast domains that are possible. If you're old enough, like Ron and I, you'll remember token ring networks and things like that using physical coax cables. We'll talk about that later. But routers can avoid that using BGP and different routing protocols down here. It can get very complex, but that is actually how the internet is configured. It uses routing protocols to send traffic across different areas. Then you have a gateway that can switch from your application all the way down to your physical and help control where your traffic is going. They operate at all levels and they connect different protocols together. Proxies do not translate protocols. So that's the difference between a gateway, which can translate protocols, and a proxy is just set at a certain layer. LAN extenders or Ethernet extenders can be used to extend your network segments across physical distances. You also have wireless access points and wireless repeaters that can be used for a similar approach on wireless that discussed earlier in the week with Ron. If you missed that part, do review it in the book. Okay, we're going to jump into a little bit of transmission medias. So your 802.3, which is used for your Ethernet, usually a star or bus type topology, two-way communication across layer 2 and layer 1, which is your physical network. It uses CSMDB to avoid your collisions, whereas in your physical layer 1, you can have collisions. As you can see here, how much the network speeds have expanded, and we're past the future possibilities where now we have 100 gigabit connections and higher using fiber optics and other communication methods like that. Your 802.11 series used for Wi-Fi. There's going to be a lot of different acronyms after that, A, B, C, D. They're just a way of showing you the maturation of the Wi-Fi technology being used, as well as a way for you to understand what can connect with what. So if you have an AC, it's usually backwards compatible with some of the older ones, but if you only have a D, it cannot connect to an AC. Coax, good old network cable, also used for TVs. So when you have cable TV, it's using a coax cable. It's a way of separating the inner layer and the outer layer, which prevents the inner copper layer from the outer shielding. The outer shielding prevents electromagnetic interference and leakage. Also allows it to transfer over a longer distance than twisted pair. Here's the inner conductor. You have your foiled shield and your braided shield. So these help prevent your network from being listened in to, as well as being interfered with EMIs. This kind of goes into some of the different types of cabling, the distances that they can travel. So do review this for yourself. Might not be as much of this on the testing, but it is good to know when you're out practicing in the field. Twisted pair. So this is your typical Ethernet cabling, twisted pairs. The newer ones have a shield around them similar to the coax cable, and that allows them to be installed around certain types of lighting, like fluorescent lighting, that emit a electromagnetic interference. So the shielding around this twisted pair allows it to be installed there, as well as preventing any listening in from that cabling. Yay, all the different types of twisted pairs. Now it even goes up to Cat 8. Leave that to you to review. Here's examples of different types of Ethernet cabling going up to fiber, showing even the multimodal fiber that allows it to send 10 plus gig over different modes of fiber optic light. Okay, now we're going into network topologies. Mentioned earlier, you have a physical star or a logical ring. These prevent data collisions because the data isn't traveling in the same direction, or in a physical star, it controls when the data is being transferred across the different pieces of the star to avoid the collisions. Here's an example of a star network. Problem with this is that it's slower because it has to run from top of the star to, say, the bottom of the star and around to get to the machine that it needs to get to. Now, here's an example of a bus. It's in a single line, and where that segment runs between the terminators is a collision area. So traffic can collide there. If you use a net, if you use Ethernet in a similar fashion, it would avoid the collision, but you wouldn't be using terminators like this. These terminators are reminiscent of your coax days, when you needed to terminate both ends of the coax cable, and you put a T-jumper where these machines are connected. So your star topologies, now you replace the token rings, you have a switch here in the middle, and now the switch can better direct the traffic, limiting collisions, but you have a single failure point, which is your main switch. Your mesh network allows each workstation to talk to each other, so it removes your single point of failure, more resilient, but as you can see, more complex. Your hybrid topologies depending how creative your IT team gets, combining all the different approaches together. So, Ron mentioned authorization and access. With network access control, you can use policy management and policy enforcement to deny, quarantine, or restrict access to network resources. And that can use things like certificates, which can be on an endpoint that can prevent a machine from even connecting, or you can use username and passwords or something similar that can, once connected, allow a machine to go from one part of the network to another. Free Wi-Fi, yay. Be careful. This is why Ron still recommends using a VPN while traveling, is you don't want anyone else that is on that free Wi-Fi from reading your data. PBXs. This is enterprise phone systems. So it takes your twisted pairs from back in the day and allows you to connect hundreds of phone lines using these PBX type approaches. It's like an internal network switch mechanism embedded into a large routing mechanism for phone, voice, and video transmissions. More on that long address right there that you can follow up after. Okay. So common threats to PBXs and phone voicemail systems: theft of service. So you could go in using certain tones back in the day and get access to toll calls or to voicemails. You could have disclosure of information by people monitoring the configurations and even monitoring the tones so that they could get access to the voicemails. Under unprivileged access, by listening to the tones, getting access to the voicemail system. Denial of service, sending too many signals, preventing the proper usage of the system from authorized users. And then traffic analysis, where phreakers used to be able to view the calling patterns and make conclusions on where the source and destination were. These were physical systems, so you could go to a switch room and look at the layouts. You also had remote access, where the phone operators were able to change the systems remotely, but that also meant that attackers could change the systems remotely. One example, call forwarding. They would set your phone number to call forward to their phone number. And if I were trying to call Ron, and it would end up in Brandon's phone ringing. Here's a picture of the good old days. Don't see as many of these today because we use voice over IP. POT system, plain old telephone systems. Some people still have them. They're great for emergencies, power outages, things like that, when your fancy PBX systems or voice over IP systems don't work, but also susceptible to eavesdropping, tapping, and other exploitations. VoIP encapsulates your voice and sends it over IP packages. Typically safer than landlines. Here's an example of all of them combined together in your typical business land setup. VoIP kind of breaks them all up, sends them over the internet, reassembles them back, and sends them to their destination. One of the things about VoIP is that it does need to have a fairly good connection compared to a plain old POT system to be able to send those packets over, reassemble them, and do that in a relatively short period of time. If you don't, you tend to end up with jitter or drops in. So when someone says something, you only hear them part at a time. Those are some of the symptoms of VoIP and calls not coming out the way that they should. Some attacks against them: phishing, malware, phone phreaking over VoIP systems still happens, and then spamming, where you can fake your VoIP calls, you can spoof your numbers, things like that, which were harder to do back in the day. Remote meetings. So your video over IP and similar calls. Common threats from these: risk of data breaches, risk of confidential information, especially when you're streaming and you don't know who's receiving on the other end. Your calls can also be recorded, or your video can be recorded. You have less control over it when you use these types of mediums. Okay, so some of the ways to combat that, for example, Zoom bombing that happened a lot when COVID was going around and we all started using Zoom, but we didn't put passwords on our Zoom meetings, or we didn't have Zoom meeting rooms or waiting rooms to allow someone in. We could potentially identify the guests, see who they were, require a second factor authentication from them. Instant messages. I hate saying that back in the day, but anyway, AIM, some of the IRC, some of the first messaging platforms out there, there were worms that were transferred between people, leading to denial of service attacks, as well as some of the first viruses being spread. Other threats: identity theft, authentication spoofing, because you had names or screen names, but when you don't see how a screen name has changed, and for example, using Twitter or X, you can change your @name and your display name so that you're not the same. So if you don't pay attention to them, someone can have a different @name than the screen name. That creates a security risk or a way of not knowing who that person really is. Firewall tunneling. IAMs were a way to get through firewalls because most of the IM services were over a certain port. They were highly publicized. And then therefore, some companies would leave those ports open for traffic rather than screening them. So you would be able to go through the firewall using those known ports. Data leakages, because most instant messages encapsulate the traffic. You could send data in and out, and companies might assume that it's just IM traffic or video traffic that's going through there, but it could be a file that's being sent through that same agent for that instant message or Zoom or whatever we use today, like Discord. Instant message spam. So you see that a lot today with text messages, with Twitter messages, where you have messages that come through your DM boxes. So instead of email spam, you have instant message spam. Now we jump onto email. Also very well-known ports, and then a paradise for social engineers to masquerade as others. Also get them to send information to them. Examples of email exchange: Office 365, Gmail. Sometimes people will screen for traffic from a certain domain, but not screen for traffic within a certain domain. So for example, Gmail to Gmail, they might not screen that traffic, but Gmail to Office 365, they will. So that's why it's important to properly authenticate your traffic. Start with your policies. Acceptable use. Tell your employees what you can and can't do with your email service, what sorts of traffic they can do. So should they be using your company email for their personal use? What can they send? Will you be monitoring their email? Your privacy. Backup and retention. So how long you need them for, and then if you have legal proceedings, how long they may be kept for longer than your retention period because of a lawsuit, as well as audits. So acceptable use, they should be requirements, not guidelines. SMIME, secure multi-purpose internet mail exchanges. So earlier I talked about MIMES. SMIME is the upgrade to that uses PKI or PKS certificates, PKCS, sorry, certificates. And it allows a way of signing the messages as well as enveloping the messages so that there's some integrity between them, as well as confidentiality. Then you have MIME MIME Object Security Services. So these use additional message digests to validate that the message size is what it's supposed to be, as well as the message integrity has not been changed. Privacy enhanced mail. So today, think of that maybe like a Proton mail versus a Gmail. Extra privacy enhancements where there's less ability to view into the messages. DKIM, domain identified mail. So ron.com will have a DKIM, whereas Gmail might not have a DKIM. They do, but just an example. They rely on public keys to sign it, as well as digital signatures. Pretty good privacy. This is where you have individuals vouching for other individuals, and you set up a public private key system using different encryption algorithms to encrypt your emails. Remote access. So you could set up remote access for specific services like Outlook Web Access, OWA, or remote access, where you have RDP for remote desktop protocols that allows you to control your desktop session remotely. Watch out for screen scraping. So while this is a way of remote access, you don't have full control over the end terminal. What it does is it takes a picture of the screen and sends it across the network. It's a risk for unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. Also, screenshotting is along the similar lines of screen scraping, where you can divulge information that you didn't want to. Remote access security management. So here we want to think about who do we want to allow, and then ensuring that we have strong authentications around them. We implement encryption in transit. VPN is not a complete solution here, but it is just a part of it. So VPN will allow you to tunnel into your network, but you still want to have additional authentication on top of that, because you could have infected machines that have VPN credentials and allow them to access the network. So you want to have your application authentication on top of that, your microsegmentation on top of that. So here are some of the concerns with remote access. We worried, we started to see a lot of this once people started to work remotely, and we started to create better ways of segmenting. Radius. This is an older technology, remote authentication dial-in service. This allows a device like a VPN concentrator to grant remote access to a server, or to funnel in authenticated users via a certain method. Runs on a Unix or Windows server and has a database of who can come in and who can't. Always recommend that these servers have authentication, authorization, and accounting capabilities or audit capabilities. So an example of a network architecture, dial-in user over PSTN goes into a network access system across a WAN using a AAA or a radius server, validates against a user profile, and then lets them in. Recommendations here for the diameters, depending on what you're looking to do. UDP uses TCP stream protocols. It is unreliable here, radius, because there's no integrity, there's order lacking in the feedback mechanism. Okay. I'm going to skip past this, but do read this. Centralized authentication for remote access. Essentially a way to better secure your network connection, allowing your authentication and your authorization requests to happen, as well as a reply and a validation. Point-to-point tunneling. This is one of the first types of VPNs. This allowed two IP networks to be connected directly to each other. They were easy to configure using username and passwords to connect you to a server. They were fast, but they only had a very low encryption level. They had vulnerabilities dating back to the 1990s, and some three-letter agencies have been able to break the encryptions. So not recommended for use anymore. Similar point-to-point protocols that have been broken and you shouldn't be using them anymore. CHAP, MS CHAP, PAP, EPAP, Shiva password authentication. Sessions established are not encrypted because you had to have the point-to-point session first, then you can have the authentication. So your session establishment section was not encrypted. SSTP, secure socket tunneling. Now you're starting to add an additional layer of protection, your SSL, where your socket layers were encrypted and established that secure tunnel over your P2P tunneling. Frame relays, this goes back to your physical data links. This allowed WANs to communicate over T1 connections faster. This started the extension of the ISDN or your circuit switched networks. Devices performed over this use circuit terminating equipment or DCEs, and they allowed your frame relays between your DCEs. Here's an example of this. ATMs. So these are your backbones of your data connections. You're still used today. Asynchronous transfer modes allowed high speed, at least for back in the day, supporting voice networks designed to integrate your computer and telecoms over the same channels. There's no routing because your ATM switches establish the point-to-point connections between your ATM devices. So it created those tunnels for you. One of the things about ATMs is it established your quality of service. This allowed you to specify constant bit rates variable bit rates, available bit rates, or unspecified bit rates. Essentially, what that allowed you to do is to control your traffic. So you could say a video signal was allowed this bit rate to ensure that it could not consume more than that amount of your network capacity. I know, I'm done. Wow, that was the fastest session I've ever done. Finn, Brandon, Ron, anything we wanted to additionally cover for this part of Domain 4?
One of the topics that we see in chat, both Discord and YouTube, is, Chris, you talked about a lot of older technologies, particularly with networking. Are they still relevant today? I'll let you answer, then I'll provide mine.
I would say yes and no. It depends. For example, your ATMs still function for your backbone of your optical carriers. They allow your major network segments, say your countries, your big telecommunication carriers, to connect to each other, and they form the backbone of the internet. Your frame relays still exist in many of your city infrastructures because they allow those twisted pairs that connected all your major infrastructure to still connect. So they're still there, unfortunately. But many of the other SSTPs are still there for VPNs, and SSLs, they're used in your browser communication still. So that's still there. Your point-to-point connections still there, just using better communication and authentication methods today. I would say your radius servers are still there, just in a different manner.
Used for authentication more, yes.
Yes.
One thing I want to jump in and add about MPLS, multi-protocol label switching, has replaced ATMs fundamentally. However, legacy is the bane of cybersecurity. You mentioned numerous, basically, technologies that have been around for a long time. Many organizations are very hesitant to replace it. First of all, they don't have the money to replace it. It works for them, so they don't think they need to. So next time you're wondering how much legacy is still in use, run Nmap on a network and see how many times you'll find Telnet still in use. So it may be on the CISSP, but we still see it IRL in real life. So good examples, Chris.
I would say not just Nmap. You could run any network type scanner or internet type scanner and see a lot of these older devices still being used for things like your industrial control systems. You're talking to old physical infrastructure. So they still exist. So it's important to know about how much you might use it. That depends.
Right. Still may need to secure it. So yeah.
Yes.
Good session today, Chris. Lots of good information. Any last tips for the learners about how to really understand all of the technical jargon associated with network security?
Yes, definitely. So don't forget, ask your questions in Discord. We'll be able to answer them after the fact. And we will have, what domain do we have coming up on Monday? Let me take a look.
I'm checking as well. Let's see. Monday, May 6th is Domain 5, Identity and Access Management with Brad.
Well, with that, Brendan, let's finish the show. Maybe.